Hi, my name is Mason. My family heritage comes from two countries, Ireland and Hungary. My grandmother on my father's side was adopted, so we have little knowledge about her, besides the fact that her parents were both Irish. My mother, however, has strong ties to Hungary, as her father and his family are from Budapest. One story that I gained more interest in because of the family timeline assignment was when my grandfather immigrated to the United States from Hungary. My grandfather on my mother's side was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1950. He lived there with his father, Alex, his mother, Violet, and his two brothers until 1956, more than 10 years after World War II. In October of that same year, there was a protest in Budapest held by Hungarian citizens in hope that they could gain freedom from the Soviet rule and create a more democratic government. The Soviet reaction was compliant at first, however this changed after the Hungarian leader, Imre Nagy, left the Warsaw Pact and tried to abolish the one-party rule. This was met with heavy Soviet force, with nearly 2,500 deaths from the attacks. Sometime during this revolution, my grandfather and his family fled from Budapest and found themselves on a ship headed to Ellis Island in the United States of America. Nearly 200,000 Hungarians emigrated from Hungary during the Hungarian Revolution, so I imagine the ship they were on was not too comfortable. I know very little details about the time, but the story goes that eventually, after they made it to New York, they had a different destination in mind, Washington, D.C. None of them knew any English, though, and they had very little money to work with, so they decided that their next best move was to make it to Washington. They searched and searched until my great-grandfather, Alex, found a bus that was said to be going to Washington. Unfortunately, the bus they were on was headed across the entire country to Washington State. They made it to North Seattle with little to their name, but instead of resulting to begging or living off the streets, my great-grandfather was able to create a new company called Star Maintenance, later also making coffee maintenance. This is where he would work until he retired many years later. My grandfather had similar ambitions as my great-grandfather. He owned a small newspaper company called CB News from the 1970s to the 80s in Linwood, Washington. He met my grandmother Sherry in 1969 in Seattle and got married in Mukilteo, Washington shortly after. They had my mother 2 years later in Seattle, Washington in 1971. My grandfather later moved to Tennessee, where he created his own newspaper company and real estate agency, and it is where he still lives today. This story is very inspiring to me because of the hardships that my grandfather's family had to face while trying to make a living in a new world. It is incredible to see today how my grandfather and his family persevered to make a name for themselves. My family's immigration to the United States relates to the themes of this class because of the changing of their environment due to political control. The Hungarian Revolution took place because of the Soviet rule that was left after the end of the World War II. The Soviet government essentially forced Hungary to sign a treaty with the Soviet Union so they could still have military control in the region. This worked until Joseph Stalin's death in 1953, when the Soviet Union's control dwindled across Europe. The Hungarians thought it was time to establish their own source of power as they were through with the communist Soviet government. Overall, this is one of the most influential moments of my family's history. My grandfather and his family were extremely brave to travel across the world with little money and no tools to succeed except themselves. I am incredibly proud of what they have made and for all of their accomplishments.